You're tuned in to The Last Radio Show.
Thank you for listening to The Last Radio Show. I'm John Lynch.
I'm Jen Reilly.
So, the last time we did some political stuff, today we're going to do some entertainment stuff.
Much better.
A little lighter. A little less drama.
Need a break.
Actually, I shouldn't say less drama because there's a lot of drama in the story I'm about to tell you.
Oh.
So, what do you know about the Beach Boys?
Not much.
Okay.
I do have a Brian Wilson shirt.
You have a Brian
Wilson
shirt?
I was going to wear it. I forgot. I'm so mad.
So when I say to you the Beach Boys, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Like, what do you think of when you hear the Beach Boys?
So actually, it's I Want to Meet Santa Claus, the Christmas album.
Okay.
But,
all right.
That's fine.
All right. I mean, I think a lot of people probably think surfing.
Yes.
They think girls in bikinis and hot rods and California. Right. Definitely that's their vibe.
Yeah.
That's their... They're kind of given the credit for inventing the California sound.
Right.
And,
top down.
Yep, absolutely.
Right.
Good times, kind of fun music, basically, and beach music. Maybe yacht rock before yacht rock was a thing,
right.
kind of like along those vibes.
Sure.
So the Beach Boys started out in the early 60s. The Beach Boys, originally the lineup was three brothers, Brian Wilson, and then his brothers Carl and Dennis. So the three Wilson brothers.
Okay.
Their cousin Mike Love, and Al Jardine, who was a friend. So that was the original 5 Beach Boys.
Okay.
Now, the lineup's changed a few times over the years. A couple of people have come and gone. Al Jardine actually quit pretty early on in the band, and there was a guy briefly in the band named Dave Marks. Then Al Jardines came back.
Oh.
And this is all in the early years, the early 60s, like 62 to like 65, 66.
Okay.
Now, around that time, when they first started out, they were incredibly popular. They were right there with the Beatles as like the biggest bands in the world.
Sure.
If you think of like Beach Boys songs like I Get Around, Help Me Rhonda, Surfing USA, California Girls, all those songs were done in the early 60s, like in a 5-year period.
Right.
Now they've been going ever since. They've never broken up. The Beach Boys have always been producing albums and touring.
Oh, really?
Pretty much nonstop since they started. Different variations and different people in and out of the band. But it's still going today. Mike Love is still touring as the Beach Boys.
Right.
So they really started out really popular. They were managed by their dad, Murray Love. Murray Wilson, excuse me. Mike Love's cousin. And he was a jerk.
Okay.
To put it mildly. He was pretty abusive to his 3 sons, especially Brian Wilson, because Brian Wilson was the genius of the band.
Oh, okay.
He was kind of the brains behind.
Is he the oldest?
I believe he's the oldest of the 3 brothers. He's the only one still around. Both of his brothers passed away. We'll get to that in a little bit.
Right.
But so Murray Wilson was managing the group in the early days, and his father actually worked in the music industry. He wrote some jingles, like some commercial jingles and stuff like. So he had some musical talent of his own. There's definitely a whole thing. If you were a psychiatrist, you could analyze that. He was probably trying to live through his son a little bit.
Course, right.
The genius music guy, and they had a lot of difficult things. And I don't know if there was much physical abuse, but there was definitely mental abuse.
Right.
Eventually, they fired their dad.
Oh.
So at some point in the early 60s, yes. So that didn't really work out well for them in the beginning. But at the time that he was running them in the early years, they were extraordinarily popular.
Right.
Again, when they started out, they had 37 songs reach the top 40 in Billboard. Wow. So that's a lot. And most of it, again, was their early years, the first few years that they were together. They've sold 100 million records worldwide. They're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Really, when you make a list of like the all-time greatest rock and roll bands, they're right there.
Sure.
They're up there with the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, and all the other big names in rock and roll history. Now, through the years in the early 60s, they were in a little bit of a rivalry with the Beatles.
Now, they were the same, not the same sound, but they never changed their sound, the Beach Boys, right? Like the Beatles went off and
we'll get into that.
Okay.
That's coming up
okay,
soon.
But for the beginning of the career.
A lot of it was definitely the surfing music kind of sound, definitely.
And this was when the Beatles were pop, like not before they went.
Yeah, this was the early days of the Beatles too. The I Want to Hold Your Hands, Hard Day's Night Beatles and stuff. The pre-Sgt. Pepper Beatles.
Right, that's right.
And so they were kind of matching the Beatles hit for hit and, top album for top album. They were touring, then, going to these, they had Screaming Girls chasing them too, the classic Beatle thing. And Then around the mid-'60s, around 66, the Beatles put out an album called Revolver. Actually, first they put out an album called Rubber Soul, which was kind of where they started to evolve their sound a little bit. And it was definitely kind of considered groundbreaking at the time. Brian Wilson heard this and wanted to evolve the Beach Boys sound. So again, it was a rivalry, a friendly rivalry. I don't think they disliked each other. They were definitely fans of each other's music. And he put out an album called Pet Sounds.
Okay.
Now, Pet Sounds is considered by music critics one of the greatest albums of all time.
Would I know any songs?
You would know definitely some songs to it. We'll go through the list of them in just a couple of minutes. But basically, Pet Sounds was considered groundbreaking. Paul McCartney heard Pet Sounds, and he was inspired. So the Beatles did the Revolver album, which was even more interesting and more diverse and more along the lines of, deeper music, let's just say, not just like pop hits, just like catchy tunes, but like more thinking man's music, if you will.
Sure.
So they basically, I guess the best known song from Pet Sounds was God Only Knows. God Only Knows.
That's a great song.
One of their classics.
Actually, one of my favorites.
It's a beautiful song.
Yeah.
Again, Brian Wilson wrote most of these songs, and he was the driving force creatively behind the band. So the Beatles put out Revolver, and Brian Wilson started working on an album called Smile. And he was going to do all this like really deep and involved stuff. And one of the first songs he put together was Good Vibrations, which is probably the best known Beach Boys song, I guess, or it's definitely, one of the top 2 or 3.
Right.
And that was, at the time, it was the most expensive song ever to record because he had so many different techniques and other musicians coming in and all this kind of stuff. So it was this groundbreaking experimental kind of musical thing. Now, that was going to be the centerpiece of this album called Smile. Before the Beach Boys finished Smile, the Beatles put out an album called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is fairly well known, I think, at this point. I would go and I should say most people think it's the best album of all time. When Brian Wilson heard Pet Sounds, he kind of like
Sgt. Pepper.
Sgt. Pepper.
Yeah.
Thank you. When he heard Sgt. Pepper, he just kind of gave up. He's like, I can't compete with this. And, he was still working on Smile. And this is where Brian Wilson's story takes a really tragic kind of turn.
So it was the Beatles' fault.
It was the Beatles' fault.
I never knew this.
Yes,
Look at
basically.
Okay.
So Brian Wilson at that point started doing some more drugs. And he probably had some undiagnosed mental issues, maybe bipolar. There's a lot of debate. Nobody really knows for sure exactly what his situation was. But he started to withdraw a bit from the band. And he didn't tour with them anymore. And they actually brought in another band member named Bruce Johnson to tour with the band at that point. So Brian would just work in the studios. The rest of the guys would still go out and tour as the Beach Boys. But Brian Wilson had social anxiety, didn't want to perform on stage.
Did they release Good Vibrations or Smile?
They did. They released Good Vibrations as a single.
As a single, okay.
The record label wanted to put out the album because obviously that's how they make money is by putting out the records. So it was never finished. So they kind of did a kind of a different kind of version of the album that was not really what Brian Wilson intended. It was called Smiley Smile.
Okay.
So that actually came out and was officially released, and Good Vibrations was on that album.
Okay.
And it did pretty well and everything like that. But right at that point, right around 67, is when the Beach Boys kind of fell off the map musically in terms of making hits and being popular. That was the Summer of Love. Things were getting kind of deeper and heavier in music.
Right.
And they kind of got left behind a little bit. And again, that was probably due in part to the fact that the guy who was their creative guy was maybe having a mental breakdown at this point.
Sure.
So in the late 60s, they still put out records, and they were still trying to, kind of keep up with, the hippie movement and the flower power and the acid rock and, trying to be relevant and hip, but it never really worked. Now, this is where the rift between Brian Wilson and Mike Love probably started. Because Brian Wilson was the creative guy and Mike Love was the guy who's like, you know what, we're making a lot of money here. Let's keep making a lot of money.
Right.
And there's a very famous line that's attributed to Mike Love, which nobody knows if it really happened or not, but Brian was showing Mike Love something really bizarre and like experimental. And Mike Love said, Brian, don't fuck with the formula. Because, let's write a song about surfing and,
it's going to make us a ton of money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the rift between Mike Love and Brian Wilson, which still to this day is kind of a thing.
Oh, okay.
It's still going on. They're the two main members who are still around from the band from the whole time. Yeah. So
they sort of blame each other probably for that.
Maybe. Definitely there was the issue Brian Wilson had mentally were definitely a big part of this. So in the late 60s, now there's still the other members of the band, Carl Wilson, Dennis Wilson, Al Jardine, and Bruce Johnson. Al Jardine came back into the band at this point. The guy, Dave Marks, left the band. They still put out some records, and they were, there's some interesting stuff if you listen to those records as a music fan, but they really weren't very commercially successful.
Okay.
There was a lot of theories why, people kind of looked at them as old-fashioned because they just thought of the early hits. But, again, the Beatles had some old-fashioned hits and then were able to evolve. You mentioned that in the beginning. They were able to evolve and were known for that.
Right.
The Beach Boys couldn't really get over that hump.
Well, you're saying because one of the members liked where they were, right? So
yeah,
I guess
that was definitely part of it.
That
was definitely part of it. So that's kind of the brief history of their glory days up until when things kind of went south for them. Then a lot of bizarre things started happening to this band.
Tell me.
So we're going to get into the dark side of the Beach Boys. And again, a lot of this has to do with Brian Wilson and his mental issues. Basically, in the late 60s, at some point around 68, Dennis Wilson, who was one of the three Wilson brothers, who was the drummer of the band, was driving down the road, and he saw a couple of girls who were hitchhiking. It was the 60s. They were kind of, hippie girls kind of thing. And Dennis Wilson, being a rock star, picked up the two hitchhikers and took them back to his house.
Okay.
So there's a little... we could probably guess what happened, but the interesting part about all that, and again, probably every rock star did something along these lines. These two girls were part of a group that was known as the Manson family.
Oh,
as in Charles Manson.
This is ringing a bell.
Charles Manson,
okay.
Yes. So the next day, Dennis Wilson, like the girls, stayed at his house. And Dennis Wilson said, I got to run out and do some things. I'll come back later. You can stay here, whatever. And he comes back, and Charles Manson's in his house.
Oof.
Now, this is before the murders and everything, the LaBanca murders and all that. So they ended up living in his house for, months. The Manson family, this whole group of hippies, and, there was drugs, and there was sex and rock and roll and all this kind of stuff.
Oh, my God, he's lucky he survived it.
He's very lucky he survived it, and actually, maybe almost didn't, basically,
sure.
It's definitely, it's a scary story when in hindsight. And now the thing is, Charles Manson actually thought of himself as a musician. He wanted a music career.
Yeah.
And he wrote some songs, and actually the Beach Boys recorded one of his songs.
Oh, this give me the chills.
Yeah. Basically, Charles Manson wrote a song called "Cease to Exist," which, if you look at it from Charles Manson's mind, you can kind of get some dark tones from that. Definitely from that title. They changed the title to "Never Learn Not to Love," which definitely sounds a lot more
Talk
positive.
About changing it commercially.
Yeah, they shifted gears pretty good on that. Basically, but. So at some point, Dennis Wilson got to the point, these people are just mooching off me. I got to get rid of them. It's, it's kind of a bad scene. So he kicked everybody out, and he actually sold the house and moved. And there is conjecture that the night of the Manson murders, when they went looking for houses, they thought they were going to Dennis Wilson's new house.
Oh, really?
Yes. They apparently got an address wrong. And so there is that's not 100% known to be fact.
Okay.
But there is some subjective ideas about that it's possible.
I thought that they lived in that house before, knew somebody that lived, so that's what it was. They thought it was.
Yeah, there's this connection to, so then of course the Manson murders happened. And ironically enough, Charles Manson also is connected with the Beatles because they wrote Helter Skelter on there. So again, that Beach Boy Beatle connection there is kind of weird in a very dark way.
Yeah, scary.
That's so basically, Dennis Wilson never really recovered for himself.
Yeah.
He had some issues too with substance abuse. But he was kind of freaked out by it, which is understandable given the circumstances, and given what, we know about them. And then, the other Beach Boys at that point, there was some negative against the band because they were associated with Charles Manson in the public eye.
Right.
Which, again, they didn't obviously have anything to do with any of the really bad stuff that the Manson family did. But one of the Beach Boys did hang out with the Mansons. I mean, it's pretty wild when you get to it. So they get through all that. Then, again, commercially, they're not having much success. And they actually brought in a couple of guys into the band, a guy named Blondie Chaplin and a guy named Ricky Fatara.
Now, what year are we in?
We're
around?
Late 60s, early 70s.
Okay.
Yeah, like 69 to like 72 or so, let's say, in that era. So these two guys joined the band for a couple of years. And it was interesting because they were from South Africa. So it was kind of, obviously this whole band that was a family for the most part and grew up in California. They were trying to do things a little different and trying to be creative.
Yeah.
So you give them some credit for that. They bring in these guys. And again, this was because Brian Wilson wasn't as involved in the band anymore. He was very disassociated at this point. And this is where he kind of went through and again, a lot of this we don't know for sure what's true or what's not, but there are a lot of stories about Brian Wilson that he spent 3 years in bed. Did not leave his house, didn't take care of himself, put on a lot of weight. He very famously had a sandbox in his living room with his piano in it. So because he liked to play the piano at the beach, but he wouldn't go outside to the beach, kind of thing. So he, again, was going through a lot of stuff. The band was trying to figure it out. The other band members were trying to pick up the slack and bringing in these new guys.
Right.
Never really had some commercial success. At this point, they were with Capitol Records through most of their successful years. So they jumped over to another record label because Capitol was like, you know what, you're not making us money anymore. The contract was up. So they signed with a new record label. So Capitol Records still had the rights to all their greatest hits and all the big songs. So they put out a greatest hits album.
Under the new label?
No.
The old?
Capitol. Yeah, just the Beach Boys' greatest hits.
Oh, gotcha. They could still do that.
Yeah.
Right.
And it sold phenomenally well. Again, they had a million great songs.
Right.
So it sold really, really well. So at this point, the Beach Boys decided to tour as more or less an oldies act.
Right.
Playing
I think I
their
have
greatest
that album,
hits.
actually.
It's
Vinyl.
everybody does have that album.
Uh-huh.
It's one of the best-selling albums of all time, the Beach Boys, greatest hits collection. And again, if you look at all their hits, most of them are between 62 and 67, even though they've been recording for years.
Right.
So they went out and started touring as a nostalgia act. And again, this was, this didn't help them, though, get any commercial and a critical acclaim.
Right.
Because they were kind of looking like sellouts. And again, this kind of falls into Mike Love's line of thinking.
Yeah.
As opposed to Brian Wilson's line
and now
of
at
thinking.
at this point, the Beatles are still... Or maybe they're broken
up.
I don't know.
By this point, the Beatles are broken up. Yeah, but they're still,
right,
Paul
but John Lennon's doing his own thing.
John Lennon's doing Imagine. Paul McCartney's doing Band on the Run.
Right. So they've evolved.
They're doing their own thing. George Harrison did All Things Must Pass.
Yeah.
Ringo had hits. So, but at this point, the Beach Boys were just kind of locked into being this oldies band.
Right.
And so but again, they kept trying to reinvent themselves and be relevant again.
Right.
So what they looked at is the thing they needed to do was to get Brian Wilson in a good place mentally to get him back and working.
To write songs.
To write songs for the band, yes, exactly. So they brought in a psychiatrist to help out, this guy named Eugene Landy. And basically he was probably maybe a charlatan, nobody, it's definitely a lot of debate on whether or not this guy, he did some interesting things like basically moving in with Brian Wilson and controlling everything.
Didn't learn from the Manson family?
No, exactly. They're just inviting people into the house.
I don't even talk to strangers. I don't know what's happening.
Didn't your mom ever tell you not to talk to strangers? They clearly did not listen to that. So they brought this guy, Eugene Landy. I mean, at least he was, somewhat accredited and supposed to be a doctor. And he basically took over every aspect of Brian's life. And when Brian would write a song, he would get co-writing song credits.
Ooh.
Yeah, he was definitely trying to this was his cash cow. He was looking at Brian Wilson as this is, so he was getting producer credits on Beach Boys songs and all this kind of weird stuff.
I guess he felt like he got him out of his shell and working
again. So. Yes, exactly.
He wanted credit?
So now Brian Wilson did get a little bit better at this time, to be fair. Mm-hmm. He was a little more active with the band, did some stuff. They did some tours where they actually, like, he came out on tour with him, which he hadn't done in years. And they did a whole big, like, advertising campaign called Brian's Back. And it was a big deal in the mid-'70s, like 75, 76, around that time. And then they basically realized that this guy was probably ripping them off financially, this guy, the psychiatrist, Eugene Levy. And they, not Eugene Levy, that's the actor. Like, wow. Landy, Dr. Eugene Landy. But he would be good, probably better choice. Yeah. But so they basically fired him, the psychiatrist.
Okay.
And then Brian started to regress a little bit again. And then this is in the later 70s now and into the beginning of the 80s. And Brian Wilson actually brought Eugene Landy back in at some point at that point. And again, he was kind of controlling his life again. This caused even more rift between the rest of the Beach Boys. Now, around this time, again, there's so many bizarre twists and turns.
Yeah.
So you got, now, a lot of the band was having definitely some drug issues.
Right.
Definitely. Mike Love apparently has claimed he never did any hard drugs, which, we'll take his word for that.
Right.
But the Wilson brothers, Carl, Dennis, and Brian, definitely did. And definitely had.
This is the 70s.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
Right?
For 60s into the 70s and even the early 80s at this point. So they definitely had their own issues and their own challenges with dealing with that. And so Dennis Wilson, again, probably having some issues with the whole, like, going through the Manson thing.
Yeah.
Definitely had somewhat of a harder time. Now, he married this girl who apparently, and again, none of this, there's a lot of stuff that's not, like, we're not sure exactly what the truth is because there's lots of different versions of these stories. But he married a girl who was the illegitimate daughter of Mike Love.
Wait a minute. Doesn't that make them cousins?
That makes it. Yes, that makes them cousins. Yes,
Okay.
yes, you're right to be concerned.
Okay,
that would make her his second cousin.
Right. Okay.
Because Mike Love is cousin to the Wilson brothers.
Right.
And so now, Mike Love this was an illegitimate child. Mike Love denies that it's his child.
Okay.
So, but a lot of people say he's probably just doing that, and she probably is his child. Yeah. But again, this caused a rift between Dennis Wilson and Mike Love because, there's definitely some issues there. And again, this girl was much younger, too, than Dennis Wilson because it was his cousin's daughter. Yeah. So, it was, there were, definitely some issues there. So Dennis Wilson had been married a couple of times, been divorced a couple of times. He lived on a boat. Interesting side note about Dennis Wilson, he was the only Beach Boy who surfed. He was the only one who actually knew how to surf. None of the other ones did.
Wow.
And so he was actually, and what is more ironic is the way he passed away because he drowned.
Oh, he did? Oh,
yep. He lived on a boat, and apparently on the boat he had one of his ex-wives, like some of her possessions, and he got mad one day and threw them overboard. And then a few days later, he's like, I should get those back. And he started diving down to get it, but he was drunk at the time, and he drowned, and he passed away in 1983. Which is obviously very tragic. And again, money don't buy you happiness, unfortunately,
Goodness.
So around the same time, now we're into the 80s now. This was 83 he passed away. And again, way past the prime years of the Beach Boys.
Yeah, they're still trying to.
But they're still touring and they're still selling out tours and making a lot of money playing the old greatest hits.
Right, like nostalgic.
Yep. And one of the things that was a tradition for a lot of years is on the 4th of July, because they were the All-American band,
right?
They would play in Washington, D.C., like right in front of the Washington Monument.
I did read about that recently, yeah.
Yep, they did that for years, and I think they still do it, and or some version of that. So in one year, in I believe it was 83, they were going to be doing a concert on the 4th of July.
Right.
And a guy by the name of James Watt, who was the Interior Secretary under Ronald Reagan, Ronald Reagan was president at the time, said, we don't want them, we don't want the bad influence of rock and roll, So
Beach Boys?
The Beach Boys,
right? Like,
yes.
I feel like there might have been other bands to go after, but
yes, exactly. This wasn't, Black Sabbath. This was the Beach Boys. But so
Ozzy's ripping.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if that happened yet.
Probably around this time, actually. Yeah, right around this time. So we'll have to do an Ozzy episode, too.
Yeah.
We definitely got to dig into him. Yeah,
right.
There's a lot there, too. So he basically said, we don't want the Beach Boys there. And they got Wayne Newton to perform instead.
Always Wayne Newton.
Go to Wayne Newton is the good and pure guy to go
back
to.
Wayne Newton.
Yeah. Yeah. So Ronald Reagan actually eventually overrode his secretary and said, like, you're an idiot.
Right.
You know, where people don't like this.
Right.
So the Beach Boys did eventually do the show.
Okay.
So again, this was when they're in this period of being this nostalgia act. And they did have a brief surge in the mid-'80s where they actually had a couple of hit songs.
When did they come out with the Christmas album?
That was in the glory years.
Oh, that
in the
was
60s.
back in the 60s?
That was back in the
just-
60s.
oh,
Yes,
okay. I just discovered it in the 80s.
No, it's a classic.
Yeah.
It's a classic. Yeah, it's a classic. But in the 80s, they actually had a couple of hit songs. They did a version of the song "Wipeout" with this is just one of my favorite things. With the Beach Boys did a version of the song "Wipeout" with the Fat Boys, the rap group, the Fat Boys from the 80s.
Uh-huh.
And they did like a weird rap version of the song "Wipeout," which is a surf song, but not a Beach Boys song.
Right. I don't
And
remember
actually,
that.
the original version didn't even have lyrics because "Wipeout" is just kind of an instrumental.
Yeah.
But it became a big hit. And then the next year, the Beach Boys did a song called "Kokomo."
Oh, that was that right?
Yeah, that was on
right.
from the movie Cocktail,
Yes.
the Tom Cruise movie Cocktail, and that was a massive hit.
Yeah.
And that was around the time that John Stamos joined the band.
That I remember that.
Yes.
Oh, right.
The guy from Full House, John
Right.
Stamos.
I think that's when I became interested in the Beach Boys, to
a
be
lot
honest
of
with you.
a lot of people did. They had a revival at this
He was
point.
very cute.
Adorable.
I mean,
but
yeah.
so John Stamos started touring with the Beach
Yes.
Boys, which is just bizarre. And like John Stamos was a Beach Boy fan growing up,
Yeah.
and it was kind of almost like a rich guy going to fantasy camp. Like he got to actually like hang with his heroes and like play rock star kind
Mm-hmm.
of thing. And so he's in the Kokomo video. You see him playing the bongos in the video. It's
Right.
classic. And he still occasionally does shows with the
Oh,
Beach Boys
really?
to this day. Yep. Yeah, it's crazy kind of thing.
It
And
is
again,
crazy.
but they firmly embrace the nostalgia because Kokomo was kind of a throwback to the Beach Boys' old sound
Yes.
kind of thing.
Right.
And Brian Wilson at this point, again, was sometimes with the band, sometimes not with the band. He would tour with them, but then he wouldn't. They'd be suing each other.
Right.
A lot of stuff going on at this point. So then in 1988, the Beach Boys were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Okay.
And it was the third year of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They went in the same year as the Beatles. Again, that Beach Boy connection, which is kind of weird.
Right,
It always
yeah.
kind of runs through it. When the Beatles went into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, of course, this was after John Lennon had died. Paul McCartney didn't go to the induction ceremony because he said, like, people are going to think it's a Beatle reunion. I don't want that.
Oh.
And they were suing each other too at some points. There was still some legal issues with the Beatles at this point. So only George Harrison and Ringo Starr showed up. That was a big deal. That was like people like, oh, Paul McCartney didn't show up for the Beatles going into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Paul McCartney, as Lynch later said, he regretted doing that.
Right.
But that's a whole other thing. So, but the same year, Mike Love went in with the Beach Boys, and Mike Love gave a speech for the Beach Boys, and basically ripped everybody apart, like ripped apart the
At the
Beatles
ceremony?
at the during his speech.
During his acceptance
He's standing
speech?
there in speech. He said, he's like, we did 180 concerts last year. The Beatles couldn't do that.
Oh, my
He's
goodness.
like, Mick Jagger couldn't do that. He said Mick Jagger didn't have the guts to show up here tonight. Now Mick Jagger was there. And actually, Mick Jagger performed on stage with the Beach Boys later in the show. And it was this whole thing, like he ripped Billy Joel.
Was he high or something, or no? Just
he's
high on himself.
kinda high on himself.
Right.
He definitely has an ego problem,
Yeah.
Mike Love. There's definitely that shines through with Mike Love whenever you hear him interviewing. And as he's gotten older, he also talks about himself being a ladies' man, which gets a little creepier as he gets a little older.
Oh, I gotta Google this guy.
You can find some interviews where, I believe he's in his 80s now, and he's still touring, amazing that he's still going out there. When you see videos of their most recent concerts, it's a little tough to watch sometimes.
Were they at Jones Beach a couple of years ago with Chicago?
Yeah, I believe they were.
I think I
Yeah.
saw that. That's might have been where I got the shirt from.
Maybe.
But I think they walked Brian Wilson out on the stage.
Yeah, they do that sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Vaguely. Well, it didn't make an impression, clearly.
Yeah. It's, if you think and you don't know.
Right, I'm like,
but
I think I
that
saw
tells you
that.
everything. Yeah. So that's kind of like, that was kind of like the last big controversy, I guess, with the band. But Carl Wilson, the other Wilson brother, he passed away in 98. He had
Right.
lung cancer. And so you still have Brian Wilson and Mike Love still around as the main members. Bruce Johnson, who has been in and out of the band a couple of times, he still tours with Mike Love as the Beach Boys.
Okay. So the Beach Boys are only tour. Who's touring now?
Mike Love, and Brian Johnson. And Al Jardine is still around, who was one of the original members. They kind of occasionally will pop up with each other. Right. They just actually did a movie that was released on Disney Plus last year, a documentary on the Beach Boys, which got a lot of criticism because it was kind of a puff piece.
Well, it certainly didn't go into
it.
This.
It didn't go into a lot of the things we're talking about.
Charles Manson was mentioned. But.
Yeah, exactly. And there's definitely the one thing that shines through in recent years is still the feud between Brian Wilson and Mike Love.
Oh, so they're not touring. So
no,
I didn't see them together.
No, it might have been just Brian Wilson touring on his own.
Yes,
yeah.
maybe
because Brian Wilson tours like Brian Wilson. Like Mike Love has the rights to the Beach Boys name, so he tours as the Beach Boys. I think when Mike Love tours, he tours as when Brian Wilson tours, he tours as Brian Wilson playing the music of the Beach Boys. But he can still play the music, right? Because most of it is his songs.
Right.
In recent years, through the early years and through most of the history of the Beach Boys, it was always Brian Wilson wrote the songs.
Right.
Mike Love said, well, actually I co-wrote a lot of them. And that's like a whole kind of thing, too, where they're fighting about that and suing each other and all this kind of stuff. So it's definitely, and then also recently Mike Love has come out as a supporter of Donald Trump, and that is kind of,
really?
That's definitely not helped his image in some circles for sure.
Right.
So they fight about politics, and they're basically two old men kind of arguing. And
my goodness!
And Brian probably has his good days and bad days because of his history.
Yeah.
So that is the story of the Beach Boys to where we are today. And again, Mike Love is still touring as the Beach Boys.
Right.
You could still see a Beach Boys concert, right now.
Yeah.
And he's out there, and it's amazing. Again, they never broke up. They, been touring from 62 till today.
That's unbelievable now. And people who are just introduced to the Beach Boys just hear this music and are like, yeah, let's just go party on the beach.
Again, it's, a lot of it is very positive, good vibrations.
Yeah, that's great.
Kind of sums up what they were about their music, and especially those early days.
Yeah.
Summertime, nothing like listening to the Beach Boys at the beach. I mean, that's, And, Brian Wilson had a theory that if they weren't called the Beach Boys, they would have been taken more seriously as an act after, their glory years.
Right.
He wanted to change the name to just The Beach. I don't know if that would have worked. Yeah, the Beach Boys, But, he wanted to drop the boys because he's like, well, we're men now.
Oh, right.
So I get where he's coming from.
Yeah.
It's not a bad idea. I don't know if it's going to work, but
the Backstreet Boys, same. Yeah, boys. You can't use boys.
Yeah, boys.
Eventually,
boys
you grow up.
Yeah, eventually you do grow up, and they've grown up and they've grown old now at this point. And so that's so now you got a knowledge of the Beach Boys.
Fascinating. I'm going to go Google Brian Love.
Mike Love.
Sorry.
Mike Love. Yes.
Oh, I can see that. I don't even know.
Yeah. But there's definitely some interviews you can find online where he just kind of comes across as very arrogant, and full of himself. And again, very successful person, so you got to give him credit for maybe there's a reason he's arrogant.
Sure. Do we blame the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson's dad, for any of this? Is he the root of the problem?
I mean, it definitely started there. I mean, definitely some things. Definitely Brian's issues mentally, I'm sure, started with that.
Yeah.
That he had this confrontational relationship with his dad. Definitely wasn't a good thing.
They got to do some sort of expose about all the dads, like the Jackson 5 dads.
Yeah, there's some bad ones out there. There's a
lot of dads.
There's some bad ones
control.
out there.
Yeah, interesting. Anyway.
Definitely. I mean, there's a story, when John Lennon never knew his dad because he kind of left his mother after when she had him, and but then all of a sudden, he was said, "Sonny boy, I want to be your dad again." When he had,
after he had millions
when the
of dollars.
Beatles were a big thing. And,
where have you been? I've been looking for you.
And John Lennon's like, no.
Good. Then all right.
Don't let the door hit you on the way out. So, there definitely is some daddy issues in rock and roll.
For sure.
But so there you have it. The history of the Beach Boys, the dark side of the Beach Boys.
Good vibration.
Charles Manson marrying your cousin, suing each other, having the White House say don't play it. There's some stuff there.
Yeah.
There's some baggage there. And again, I think when most people hear the Beach Boys, they think, a couple of guys dancing on the beach playing a guitar.
It's like a Jimmy Buffett thing
Definitely
to me.
A Jimmy
I'm
Buffett
like,
kind of
they drink some margaritas, they're good.
Yep, exactly. They drank too many margaritas. Yes. That's the problem. All right, so there it is.
All right, cool.
The Last Radio Show.